Part 1. Prologue. In the beginning was the Word. Yeti, Cybermen, Daleks. Ashley Chapel stared at the images on the 3 television screens in fascination. On the first, unstoppable silver figures strode through the deserted streets of London. The second showed huge, furry creatures patrolling the silent London underground, while the final video displayed squat, metallic monsters with their ape-like servants, engaging army troops outside a country house. Chapel paused all 3 recordings and frowned. Thanks to his sources, he now had all the proof he needed that the Earth was prey to all manner of alien invasions, and it was only a matter of time before the planet's valiant defenders, Dame Anne Travers's precious unit, met their match. He sighed. The Earth needed a man of vision, a man of strength, to unify and protect. He thought of his late lamented employer, Tobias Vaughan, and shook his head. During the 5 years that he had been Vaughan's personal assistant, Chapel had bought into his dreams of unity and direction. The people of Earth were weak and directionless, and Vaughan had known that he was the only one who could lead humanity and protect it from conquest. But Vaughan had made a single mistake. His allies were ill-chosen, the Cybermen had betrayed him, and Vaughan's life had been the cost of that betrayal. Chapel stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, night was falling over London, but he could still make out the reconstruction work going on at Canary Wharf. He smiled. When Cesar Pelli's tower was complete, Chapel fully intended to occupy it with his portfolio of companies, but there were more pressing matters to attend to that evening. Opening a cupboard, he pulled out a metal tray, holding a complex assembly of electronic circuits, very special electronic circuits. Vaughan may have died, but his legacy lived on. The micro-monolithic circuit, invention of the Cybermen, was Chapel's. He now owned the patent, and despite its inclusion in virtually every piece of electronic household equipment, only Chapel knew of its hidden nature. For the last 5 years, he had been experimenting with the circuit. Vaughan's notes, and Chapel's genius, indicated that the circuits could be used to boost the latent telepathic potential of the human mind, and his experiments up till now validated that idea. But experiments on animals could only reveal so much. The time had come for the final test of the circuit's abilities, placing the thin metal circlet over his head. Chapel switched on the device. As a faint humming rose from the assembly, he concentrated, reaching out with his mind. Vaughan had first contacted the Cybermen through the clumsy medium of radio, but radio could lie. Radio could hide the truth. Anybody who heard Chapel's pleas would see the conviction in his heart and would be incapable of lying in return. Chapel would choose his allies wisely, unlike Vaughan, and those allies would give him the backing he needed to set the Earth straight once more. For the briefest of moments, Chapel was convinced that he could hear Vaughan's mocking laughter, but that was impossible, wasn't it? And then his mind touched something, someone, an intellect that burnt more brightly than the sun, an incandescence of genius that radiated inside Chapel's skull. Sarah Quazell. It wasn't just a name, it was a word of power, of glory, of majesty, a word that resonated with possibilities, all of which could now be achieved. Chapel had found his ally. Dawn was breaking when Chapel finally severed the link. Not that he would ever need the device again. He and Sarah Quazell were bonded, and together they would usher in a new age of harmony and prosperity, a new millennium. Part 1. Fin de siècle. 1. "Melanie Bush, you really are a sanctimonious old prude," snapped Chantal Edwards. "We're in the 1990s, not the 1890s. The attractive brunette shook her head. "You haven't changed, have you?" Mel's expression didn't waver. Morals were morals, whatever the century, and her old university friend's brazen revelation that she was having an affair with a married man deserved only one response. "I stand by what I said, Chantal. What about this man's poor wife? Sitting at home, unaware that her husband's having yet another romantic tryst with you. How must she be feeling?" Mel was so indignant that she almost stamped her feet. In an attempt to calm down, she looked around the large room, which was festooned with Christmas decorations and packed with her contemporaries, and sighed. What secrets were they hiding? In calendar terms, it had been 10 years since she had last been in the student union of the University of West London, 10 years in which her former classmates had married, had affairs, had babies. But for Melanie Bush, time traveller, it had only been a couple of years since she had sipped her orange juice and winced at the noise from the latest student band. Such were the vagaries of time travel, she decided, returning her attention to Chantal. Well, Chantal sighed. His wife happens to be doing exactly the same thing, Melanie, she continued. Only last week we had to leave a restaurant because she came in with her toy boy. Mel ran a hand through her cascade of red curls. Then you're all as bad as one another. 2 wrongs don't make a right, you know. But she was suddenly acutely aware that Chantal had gained an experience of life over the last decade that she had missed out on, and momentarily wondered whether she should try to temper her high moral stance. Her friend's next words made her mind up for her. So how's your love life? Or did you finally decide to become a professional virgin? Chantal transfixed her with a cold stare. Any response that Mel was composing, and she was having difficulty, was aborted by the arrival of Julia Prince. Plain and unremarkable when she had been a student, the last 10 years had affirmed Julia's frumpiness. Mel couldn't understand why the woman didn't do something about her hair, her clothes, her makeup. But at least she and Julia had seen eye to eye on those delicate ethical issues. "Julia!" she exclaimed, grasping her hand warmly. "You look—" For a second, Mel's natural kindness was almost overridden by her desire to say something about her friend's appearance. But her sensitivity won out. "You haven't changed a bit," she gushed. The woman with the mousy hair tied up in a bun and thick glasses smiled, revealing slab-like teeth. "Nor have you, Melanie. Have you been in suspended animation for the last 10 years? Mel smiled contritely. The computer science reunion at West London University was neither the time nor the place for her to admit that she had spent the last couple of years in the company of an eccentric time traveller. Nor could she explain to Chantal, Julia, or any of the others that she had persuaded, although bullied might have been a better description, that same time traveller into nipping forward to 1999 so that she could attend the long-arranged reunion. She thought of a suitable reply that was both sufficiently evasive yet truthful. Naturally. She glared at Chantal. Healthy living and a clear conscience, much better than any pills or potions, or— The next words were spoken as if blasphemous, and directed towards the unaware Leonore Pridge and her reshaped nose. Or surgery. Leonore's ears must have burned because she looked directly at Mel and gave a tiny wave. "So, what are you doing now?" asked Julia enthusiastically. "The lecturers reckoned you were the brightest one out of all of us." Already committed to a discussion on nose jobs and breast enhancements, Mel was momentarily stuck for an answer, and again she decided to fudge the issue. "Oh, I've been travelling all over, really." "I would have thought that you'd have been snapped up by one of the big computer companies, or didn't you fancy being a corporate woman?" said Chantal, making the words corporate woman sound like prostitute. Mel's perfectly accurate memory went back to her final year at West London, when the big companies had turned up to interview them as part of the so-called milk round. Her qualifications had been impressive, and all the major computer companies, such as IBM, I2, and Ashley Chapel Logistics, had offered her jobs. She had already turned down the place at I2, and after what the doctor had told her recently about that particular company, she was quite relieved. She was as broad-minded as the next person, but working for a company whose director was a bionic snake seemed almost unpatriotic, and she clearly remembered her interview with David Marker, ACL's head of development. She had been very impressed by what he had to tell her about the company, and probably would have accepted the position he offered her as a junior programmer, if the doctor hadn't intervened. "I was going to work for ACL," Mel replied. "Then you'd have been looking for another job now," Chantal pointed out. "They're all being made redundant today. I thought you would have known." "It's funny that you should mention ACL," said Julia, rescuing Mel from trying to come up with a response to Chantal. "It's all thanks to Chapel that this place is here." She gestured through a nearby window at the impressive library and computer block. 10 stories of polished aluminium. "Ashley Chapel funds the university to the tune of millions. He bailed out the university when it was having financial problems, and then pumped loads of hard cash into setting up the best comp sci department in the country." She smiled. "Then again, I'm biased. I work here. Have done since I graduated." "That's right," agreed Mel. "I remember you applying for a place here." But Julia's account of Ashley Chapel's generosity was puzzling. She could clearly remember that Chapel had been considered to be something of a philanthropist, but why fund West London University, she wondered. Surely it would have made more sense to go to one of the more prestigious universities such as Oxford or Warwick. Before she could say anything, Julia continued. "Actually, it's all a bit weird," she whispered in conspiratorial tones, ushering Mel and Chantal closer with a furtive wave. "One of the conditions of the funding was the setting up of a research team that reports directly to Chapel." "What's so weird about that?" asked Chantal, grabbing another glass of white wine from the nearest table. "Most universities have direct links with industry. It's how they survive. The company I work for does a lot of work with Luton Uni's psychology department." "That's not what I meant," said Julia. "Chapel's team is working on some really odd stuff. New computer languages, that sort of thing." Mel shrugged. "Isn't that what they're meant to do?" But Julia smiled, and Mel got the feeling that she was about to deliver the coup de grace. She wasn't wrong. With a drama-laden voice, she announced, "They've solved Fermat's last theorem algebraically." Mel cocked an eyebrow. A large part of her degree had included mathematics, and the importance of such a discovery wasn't lost on her. The algebraic solution to Fermat's last theorem, which stated that equations of the form y = x plus z were insoluble if n was greater than 2, had been a mathematical holy grail ever since the 17th century, when the French mathematician Pierre Fermat had indicated that he had proved it. Unfortunately for mathematics, he had neglected to write the proof down, claiming that the margin of his copy of Diophantes had been insufficiently wide to contain it. Others had been trying and failing to duplicate his work ever since. So solving it was a key mathematical discovery. "Fine," said Chantal, "so the university gets another award and everyone's happy." She leant over and grabbed another glass of wine. Mel couldn't help tutting. That made 6 glasses in the last hour. "You only get awards if you let people know what you've done," Julia stated. "They proved the theorem a year ago, but I haven't seen it published anywhere." "Have you?" This last question was aimed at Mel, who shook her head, but she was rather behind with her technical journals. Mainly because the sorts of journals the doctor had lying around the TARDIS were a little too esoteric for her tastes, with titles such as Abstract Meanderings in Theoretical Physics and Wormhole Monthly. "All I know is that they solved it and then kept it quiet. All seems a bit suspicious to me." Julia was really pressing her discovery. "And to me," decided Mel. Filing the information away in her photographic memory and tagging it so that she would mention it to the doctor a little later, she changed the topic of conversation to fashion, and hair, and makeup, and how they would dramatically improve Julia's life. Barry Brown sauntered down the wide corridor, hands in suit pockets, possibly not the demeanour expected from a professional, but he didn't really give a toss. Today was his last day of gainful employment, and if his bosses took offence at his casual manner, what difference would it make? Eventually, he would have to clear his desk of personal belongings, but that could wait. He was more concerned about the people he was going to miss than a few old journals and a couple of outdated books. He reached the double doors that led into the next section of the office area. In truth, the whole office was nothing more than a vast open square, partitioned into smaller areas by yellow metal walls and glass doors, and caught his reflection in the glass. He knew that he was cursed with one of those permanently miserable-looking faces, but even he was surprised by exactly how dejected he seemed. He brushed his light brown fringe out of his eyes and tutted at his collar-length hair. With all the recent upsets, he had totally forgotten to get it cut. It was time he got somebody to cheer him up, or make them as miserable as he felt, he decided maliciously. He reached the third bay in the area and crept round the partition. Louise Mason was furiously typing at the keyboard of her tablet computer, watching the words appear on the LCD screen with absolutely no enthusiasm, just desperation. "Siggy?" he whispered in her ear, smiling with satisfaction as she jumped in her seat. "Oh, it's you," she gasped, putting her hand on her chest. "You have scared me to death." She nodded at the slim black tablet on her desk before running a hand through her blonde hair. "Well, asked Barry. "What? Oh, a cigarette?" She shrugged. "Yeah, why not?" Although Louise didn't smoke, she was as much a regular in the smoking room as any of the 20-a-day brigade. Barry raised an eyebrow. "Because Derek Peartree might be in there," he laughed. The rumours of redundancies had first started back in September 3 months ago, and the ACL gossip network, infinitely more efficient than the internet, and usually coordinated by himself and Louise from the depths of the smoking room, where most of the rumours originated, had gone into overdrive, especially given the mysterious circumstances surrounding the bankruptcy of the company's longtime rival, I circumflex. All manner of possibilities had been mooted, but the truth had come in the form of a terse email message to all employees. With a few exceptions, everyone would be made redundant on the 30th of December. Derek Peartree had been the person who had appeared to take it worst of all. The first reports of his behaviour in the smoking room had been greeted with disbelief by the gossip network, but after a number of reliable witnesses had seen him crying openly, he became one of the few bits of entertainment to liven up the increasingly depressing atmosphere. Eventually, very few people in the company had failed to encounter the weeping programmer, boring everyone stupid with the same old anecdotes and the same old emotions. Louise shook her head. "No fear of that," she said. "He's off with the outplacement consultants. ACL's term for an upmarket job club," Barry mused. He fiddled with her mouse. "Then I hope they've stocked up with Kleenex." He pointed at the screen where a table of schools, qualifications, and experience stared back at him. "Another CV?" he asked rhetorically. Louise stood up, smoothing down her ankle-length green skirt and adjusting her white blouse. And then she shrugged and gave a wry smile. "Of course, some of us have got to find new jobs." There was venom in the statement, but it wasn't aimed at Barry. Rather, it was aimed down the corridor where the advanced research group sat. The 15 members of that particular team were the only survivors of the sweeping cuts in ACL headcount that Ashley Chapel had decreed, and by 6 o'clock that night, they would be the only people still employed by the company. "Calm down. It's not going to do any good if we upset Chapel's chosen few, is it?" Barry was well aware of the threat of retroactive dismissal that senior management had leaked to the gossip network. If you displeased Chapel in any way, he was well within his rights to demand the generous redundancy payment back. Not something that either Barry or Louise could really afford, given the current government's position on state benefits. The flush faded from her cheeks. "I suppose not. Anyway, how's your job search going?" Barry looked up from correcting her spelling with a puzzled look, and then realised, "I forgot to tell you, I've been accepted on that catering course. I'll be doing that for the next 3 months. He grinned as he dreamt about a future of haute cuisine, far away from technical manuals and bad-tempered programmers. Food, both cooking it and eating it, was his greatest passion, as his waistline proclaimed, and the course promised a 3-month respite from the dole queue. She smiled. "Well done. And there was me thinking that you were going to become an award-winning novelist." He pointed at the gold and silver-jacketed book that lay on Louise's desk, Programmer's Reference Guide to the ACL Probe Language. "That's hardly going to win me the Booker Prize, is it?" Louise pulled Barry from the chair by his sleeve and pulled him towards the corridor. "Given your last 3 work appraisals, I doubt it." With an ironic grunt, Barry followed her past the morbid people who were worrying about their future, and the few smug people who weren't. Well, someone had to keep her in check, didn't they? He still remembered narrowly preventing her from barging into Chapel's office and giving him a piece of her mind when the news of their imminent redundancy had been announced. "I've got a good feeling about the future. I mean, the new millennium and all that. A new beginning for all of us." "Thanks for the platitudes," said Louise, but she wasn't laughing. "I'll remember that when I'm queuing up to collect my job seeker's allowance after the redundancy money runs out. Then again, it's all right for you. You haven't got any responsibilities." Barry winced. "Thank you for reminding me of my marital status, Lou. That's just what I need." "Oh, I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean it like that." He held up a hand to stop her. I know, Cassie," he stated. "Who else? I'm a single parent and I'm about to be made redundant. What reason have I got to look forward to the year 2000? As the atmosphere grew ever more morbid, they reached the double doors that led from the office area to the toilets, lifts and smoking room, and Barry felt a slight moment of nausea in the pit of his stomach. David Harker, Chapel's head of programming development and right-hand man, was coming the other way. The atmosphere plummeted even further. While Ashley Chapel's presence was mainly due to his charismatic personality, Barker's was a direct result of his physical appearance. He was large, in the way that brick walls are large, and grey, in the way that battleships are grey. This was reinforced by a couple of things. His never-changing grey suit. Barry suspected that Marker had a wardrobe full of them, and his never-changing expression. Grumpy. Actually, that wasn't strictly true. He did smile occasionally. And then everyone knew that it was time to run for cover. But the Harker pushing open the door was the grumpy version, so Barry relaxed and hurried Louise forward before she could launch into yet another tirade. He reached into his suit jacket and felt for his cigarettes and lighter. As soon as Louise opened the door of the smoking room, she realized her error. She should have peered through the frosted glass porthole in the door and checked before barging in. But it was too late now. Barry was pushing past her, and Louise tried to suppress a smirk at his horrified expression. Derek Peartree was in the smoking room. Barry sat down in one of the plastic chairs and lit up. Louise sat opposite and shrugged. At least Derek didn't seem to be crying. "I thought you were supposed to be with the outplacement consultants," asked Barry politely. Derek leaned back in his chair and smiled, revealing a mouthful of uneven and yellowing teeth. "Well, that's where you're wrong, Mr. Brown," he said unctuously, and Louise shuddered. The man had no redeeming features. "I don't need to go searching for another position, so I don't need those do-gooders tearing my CV apart and telling me that my skills aren't marketable anymore." He scratched at the scraggly beard that just about covered his pointed chin. "You've got a job," replied Barry. That's great," he finished, trying to sound pleased for him. And failing. "Indeed I have, young man." He took another cigarette from the packet on the table and lit it. "Oh, God," thought Louise, "if only we'd been 5 minutes later. I've taken up Mr. Chapel's most generous offer. You've taken the King's shilling? You're joining Chapel's private army?" Barry sounded both surprised and angry, and Louise could understand why. They were out on their ears, and someone like Derek was staying on. It just didn't seem fair. "Doing what exactly?" asked Louise. Derek stopped trying to peer down her blouse and frowned. "My dear young lady, I can't tell you that. As a member of Mr. Chapel's advanced research team, I appreciate the need-to-know basis of the work that's going on, and since neither of you were considered suitable material for the team, it wouldn't be my place to speak out of turn, would it?" Louise sighed. She wasn't sure what was worse, Derek as an emotional wreck, or Derek as a supercilious old fart. Deciding that the latter was by far the more disagreeable, she stubbed out her cigarette and indicated for Barry to do the same. "Sorry, Derek must dash. Things to do," she muttered. "Such as?" he whined. "You're being made redundant, aren't you?" She bit her lip. "Packing, that sort of thing?" She followed Barry through the door, as Derek carried on talking. The fact that there was no audience anymore didn't seem to slow him down. Then again, Derek Peartree had always been his own best audience. "I have a meeting with Mr. Chapel later on this evening, when he'll tell me the important role I'm going to play in his operation." As the droning voice faded in the distance, Barry shook his head. "Member of the advanced research team? He's not even fit to be a member of the human race." "So what was all that about?" asked the doctor, handing Anne Travers a glass of Australian Chardonnay. He had led her to a private inglenook, well away from the fawning and inquisitive dignitaries, in a quieter room in the Dorchester. 2 leather armchairs, a low mahogany table, and a wonderful view of Hyde Park, covered in snow. Very festive, Anne decided. She sipped the wine and smiled. A 1994, a good vintage. After all these years of holding back, of bottling up her hidden horrors, the knowledge that she was just about to release it all was akin to the anticipation of having sex, and the wine was a perfect accompaniment. Indeed, this current incarnation of the Doctor wasn't that bad looking, but it was time to ease her conscience, rather than fulfill her repressed libido. "The great intelligence," she stated. The doctor frowned. What about it?" "It was defeated almost 30 years ago. I repelled it from its human host and left it adrift in the void." "It came back 4 years ago, Doctor. Or didn't that particular invasion merit your attention?" she added spitefully. He stroked his chin. "As a matter of fact, no, it didn't. Earth's defenders, the defenders that you've devoted your career to supporting, managed to overcome its perfidy without my assistance." She had to admit that the doctor was correct. The forces of UNIT, bolstered by some old friends, had proved victorious, but the cost had been in a coinage that she had not been prepared to pay. "Whether it was defeated or not, Doctor, the fact remains that it returned." She shook her head. "It's all my fault, isn't it?" She stared at him, masochistically hoping for both blame and benediction. "I brought the intelligence to Earth, didn't I?" The doctor sighed. "Would you like to hear a story about the great intelligence?" He reached out and grabbed her hand. Anne squeezed it. "I'd like that. Facing up to your demons, wasn't that what you were meant to do?" The doctor took a deep breath and picked up one of the doilies that lay on the table, protecting the varnished surface from the bowl of complementary nuts. "Before this universe was created, there was another one, a totally different universe, with alien physical laws. The heavens were green, and the stars looked like—" he chuckled. "Giant donuts, to be brutally frank. Very, very different. And, as in this universe, there were people who discovered the deeper mysteries of time and space. In this universe, they're my people, the Time Lords. In that universe, they were also Time Lords, but they were lords of a very strange version of time and space." His gaze shifted to the window and the snowy wastes of Hyde Park, but Anne got the feeling his thoughts were much, much further away. As their universe reached the point of collapse, a group of these Time Lords shunted themselves into a parallel dimension which collapsed seconds after ours. Moments later they erupted into our universe and soon discovered that they were in possession of undreamt-of powers. He swigged from his glass. "And I'm afraid that the power went to their heads, or what passed for heads given their new bodies. They decided that since they now had godlike powers, they should behave like gods, and the one called Yog-Sothoth, who had been the Time Lord's military strategist, decided to dedicate his newfound abilities into discovering whether his tactics and stratagems would have worked." He'd held up the transformed doily. It now resembled a string of white yeti. Anne placed the glass on the table. "Yog-Sothoth? Now, why does that sound familiar?" "It's the intelligence's real name, and it crops up in certain arcane literature from time to time. Over the millennia, he mounted thousands, millions of campaigns against inhabited planets, trying out the gambits and games that he had only played on computers in his previous existence. On Hiskith, he chose to use the Hisk version of koala bears to invade. On Danos, domestic animals, like dogs, were the vanguard. And on Earth, well, the intelligence seemed to have a fondness for Tibet and the Yeti." The doctor held up his hands. "Don't ask me why. Perhaps some childhood teddy bear fetish." Anne pinched up her face. "But why did the intelligence use the Yeti on the other occasions? They're hardly in keeping with the London Underground, are they?" He picked up his glass and savoured the bouquet. "Because he was under pressure to keep up with the others. After his failure in Tibet, the other transient beings muscled in and embarrassed him. Loigor had dominated Vortis until I turned up, that is, Shub-Niggurath conquered the planet Polymos and colonized it with her offspring, the Nestine consciousness." "As in the Autons?" Anne interrupted. "As in the Autons, yes," agreed the doctor with not a little impatience. "Surrounded by the success of his peers and shamed into continuing, Yog-Sothoth tried once again to control this planet. But he was desperate, short on time and resources, and he had a mountain in Tibet full of Yeti parts. Once he established a bridgehead, it was child's play for him to arrange transport to London." Anne remembered the cleaning-up operations that had followed the incursion in the underground. "The Yeti production plant that unit found in Wimbledon." "Exactly. And now there's no production plant and no bridgehead. And after the splendid show that unit put on 4 years ago, no intelligence." Anne rubbed her forehead. "If only I could be so sure. It's hovering about me. I can feel it." She waved her hand above her head. "It's going to come back." Anne, he insisted. No, the intelligence is dead, consumed by its own hatred and corruption. He lifted the glass from the table. She took a deep breath. So why do I still feel all of this apprehension? Why am I so convinced that the intelligence is going to return? The doctor shrugged. The mind is a mysterious mixture of logic and intuition, Anne. Perhaps this rarefied atmosphere of political intrigue is a little too heady for you. Steepling his fingers, he gave her a mischievous grin. How do you fancy getting away from all this? Let's leave the mandarins to their finger buffet and see out the last days of the millennium somewhere a little more sybaritic? His eyes sparkled. Anne forced a faint smile, which grew broader as she remembered a certain restaurant that she had always favoured. Grabbing her handbag, she rose, feeling unimaginably relieved. "And I know just the place." Barry pressed the enter key and watched with more than a little sadness as the last of his personal files were downloaded to Floptical. 10 years of non-management-approved activities were being written onto a single 3.5-inch optical disc in only seconds. Years of internet gossip, amusing email notes, and all manner of personal correspondence. Megabytes of information that Barry doubted he would even look at once he left ACL. But his nostalgic streak demanded that it should be kept. While the last few bytes trickled onto the Floptical, he looked at his desk. The innumerable recipes, all culled from countless magazines by both himself and the less serious-minded of his colleagues, had all been removed, leaving bare grey partition walls, enclosing a veneer desk bearing nothing but a telephone and the black packet of his tablet. ACL's tablet, he reminded himself. In a few hours, his personal computing power would be massively downgraded, as he lost the vast network of Ashley Chapel logistics, a network which had given him access to the entire world. Barry sighed and swivelled round on his chair. This pointed him in the direction of the Advanced Research Team, or Chapel's private army, as they were less than affectionately known. 5 of them were sitting around one of the circular tables, pointing and whispering at the image on a tablet screen. Not for them the depressing task of packing up the possessions of one's working life. Business carried on as usual for them, the sole survivors of the draconian job cuts. Barry caught the eye of James Campling, the most approachable of the generally high and mighty team, and gave him a little wave. Campling nodded and returned his attention to the screen. Barry shrugged and turned to his own tablet. The downloading was complete, so he removed the Floptical and shoved it in the carrier bag, squeezing it in with the posters, course notes, and copies of manuals he had written. One carrier bag. Not much to show for 10 years of loyal service, was it? No, he reminded himself, not quite 10 years. The redundancy meant that he missed his 10-year clock by 3 months. But why was he bothered by a gilded carriage clock? Others might think it to be the least of his worries. He knew why, the sense of acceptance that the clock represented. His life lacked the continuity that most people's had. Being adopted, he had grown up knowing that his origins were a complete mystery, whereas other people had their parents to look to for some clue as to their appearance. When older, Barry had only a vague description of his natural mother, and no knowledge at all about his father. Although his adoptive parents had neither hidden the truth nor withheld their love from him, there was a deep-rooted feeling of insecurity that had caused so much trouble over the last 15 years. Of course, he had tried to find his natural parents. He had lost count of the number of adoption agencies and organizations dedicated to reuniting children with their families that he had contacted. But everyone had drawn a blank, and Barry had finally resigned himself to never knowing the woman who had given birth to him. Siggy? It was Barry's turn to jump. Louise was standing right behind him, her hands on the back of his chair. He leaned his head back to look at her, and was just about to agree when he spotted out of the corner of his eye that the Advanced Research Team had vanished, probably for one of their frequent summit meetings with Chapel. When Chapel snapped his fingers, his private army started marching. He shook his head. "No, I'm not really in the mood." "Oh, come on," she urged, pointing at the wall-mounted clock. 4:30. "We'll be out of here in an hour." Her tone softened. "It could be our last visit to the smoking room." She made a trip to the nicotine-stained cupboard. Sound like the search for the Holy Grail, Barry decided wryly. "I'll be in 5 minutes," he said. "Honestly. Just let me download the rest of my stuff." Louise shrugged. "Okay, see you in a bit." Barry waited until he was certain that she was safely through the double doors before he stood up and strode over to the area in which the advanced research team shrouded their activities from the rest of ACL. Constantly aware of the people who would be walking down the corridor behind him, he tried to act with consummate calm and confidence, knowing full well that he was shaking like a leaf. He hurriedly scanned the desktops covered with magazines, flopticals, mouse mats, and the rest of the detritus that comes with being a programmer. Or a technical writer, he reminded himself, remembering his own desk before he had cleared it. And then he saw what he was looking for. Nestling innocently amongst the discarded beige towers of plastic coffee cups and piles of inch-thick periodicals. A single floptical with the word Codex written on the label in thick green felt tip. Barry knew, as did any visitor to the smoking room thanks to garrulous Ivan Crystal's delight in telling everybody everything, that Codex was Chapel's mysterious secret project, the raison d'etre of Chapel's private army. In seconds, stuttering fingers had prized open the clear plastic box and shoved the floptical in his jacket pocket before strolling nonchalantly towards the corridor. He looked around, making sure that no one had seen him. The only people he could see were Digby, the youth trainee, fussing over a broken tablet, and Dave Richards, another of the survivors, strolling into the LAN room. But neither of them had seen him. And then he set off for the smoking room. He deserved a cigarette. But as he pushed open the double doors, the reason for his theft bounced around his mind. ACL software was notorious throughout the computing industry for being too much, too late. Excellent applications, with outstanding technical documentation, he reminded himself proudly, trying to make their mark in an already saturated niche. If Chapel had finally realized this and was closing ACL down because of it, well, what the hell was his private army working on? What on earth was Codex? The reunion was coming to an end, a fact marked by the departure of most of the reunionees. But Mel remained, having switched from wine to orange juice after a single sociable glass that had lasted her hours, and was staring into the yellowy dregs, trying to make some sense of Julia's piece of academic espionage. Fermat's last theorem, solved and then ignored like an unwashed teacup, it just didn't make sense. Why would a department dedicated to research not publish one of the greatest finds in mathematical history? The problem had been preying on her mind since Julia had told her, and she had almost missed Chantal's exit with Jimmy the stud. She had been that preoccupied. Then again, she had still been able to explain to Julia about the benefits of makeup and how it was a woman's duty to make the most of her physical appearance. And after Julia had vanished, rather hurriedly, Mel decided, she had spent 20 minutes asking Leonor pointed questions about liposuction and rhinoplasty. But Mel's attention had been firmly fixed out of the window at the computer science block and library. Mel? It was Julia, she realized, and was pleased to see that she had let her hair down, literally, and applied a little lipstick and powder. Obviously, she had seen the wisdom in Mel's words, and Mel knew with certainty that Julia would see a definite improvement in her life from now on, although any change would be an improvement, Mel thought, and then chastised herself for her bitchiness. "Julia, you look wonderful," Mel gushed. Julia shook her head urgently. "Never mind that, it's about what I told you earlier." Mel held her hands up. "Don't worry, I won't breathe a word. I'm the soul of discretion," she insisted. "I know that. I also know that you're the best computer programmer out of all of us. That's why I want you to have this." She handed Mel a slip of paper, her hand shaking. Mel unfolded it and looked up in bewilderment. "What does Codex mean?" "Codex is the code name of the research project I was telling you about, Chapel's project, and the rest of the stuff represents the protocols and directory chains that you'll need to get access." "And what am I supposed to do with this?" said Mel, with not a little confusion. Julia leaned forward and whispered in her ear. "Something strange is going on, Melanie. Something evil. You're the best there is. You were always streets ahead of the rest of us. You know that." Mel blinked rapidly with embarrassed modesty. Could you hack into the chapel computer net? Asked Julia. Mel's eyes opened in amazement and horror, and then she smiled, an unfamiliar thrill stirring in her stomach. Sounds like quite a challenge, she said, slipping the paper into her miniature handbag. If you can start wearing makeup, I suppose that hacking into a computer system is the least I can do. Half an hour later, the reunion was well and truly over. Some of the former students had decamped to other bars in the student union, while others had gone home while their legs still functioned. But Julia was still sitting amongst the dirty glasses and discarded paper plates, staring into her half-empty wine glass and lost in thought. She started as a tuneful warbling came from her handbag. She reached into it and withdrew her mobile phone. "Hello? I've been waiting for you to call. Yes, she did turn up, and yes, I did give her the information, but I don't see... All right. Yes, I'm sure that she'll be able to hack in, but..." She groaned in annoyance as he ended the call, realizing that she was still as much in the dark as ever. Why the hell did David Harker want somebody to hack into his own computer system?